let's say 20% for each payment, and we stop paying after 2 payments because the drug stops working, that would be seen as a 60% discount. Right now, the maximum, the statute suggests 23.1% and then 17.1% for purely pediatric drugs. So companies, understandably, are reluctant to provide those kind of guarantees if that would reset the price for the entire population. Again, the best price legislation and the rules never contemplated these kind of agreements. So it is something that is a barrier to innovation, and in the absence of which we still continue to partner with companies like Novartis, with Spark and others, but we're limited in the amount of risk that the companies will take. And the companies on their part, frankly, and Spark is an example where they've said we would take more risk if we were able to, and companies that are out there with future therapies, the Sareptas, the Bluebirds, et cetera, they're all saying the same thing. The patient advocacy groups are saying the same thing. They understand that to facilitate access to these life-saving treatments, they need to figure out how to pay over time in a way commensurate with value. So that is a big piece that needs to be fixed. I do speak with many people in CMS and HHS. I think they understand this. They're smart people. They're committed. That they get this. I think they're challenged also by the rules that they operate within. And the guidance recently has been work within the existing system, which is hard. I do think there will need to be change, and I think there's no force for change, like coming out with some high-cost therapies and showing the world that the current regulations are barriers. A second challenge is around outcome measures, and this is a tough one. How do we agree on what constitutes success, what constitutes failure? Does going back on an older drug mean that the drug isn't working as well? Is it binary, or are there intermediate steps? And this is where we frequently get into interesting discussions and have challenges getting to an agreement. And in many cases, people like myself, perhaps naively, go into the discussion believing that you should be willing to stand by the data that was taken to the FDA to get the drug approved. And I believe that philosophically, intellectually, it makes sense. What I'm told on more than one occasion is that the scales, the tools that were used to demonstrate success are pretty much only present in a research setting, and that it's not viable and not realistic to use those when you're going broader into the real world. So, we have some interesting discussions about what does constitute success or failure. And again, there are cases such as whether, again, adding a drug to the mix indicates that it isn't working as effectively as we'd like. In some cases, in many cases, the payers think that should lead to at least a lesser payment, and the companies, the manufacturers, believe not so much. It's your decision. But again, we're just going to go with the data in terms of that, and I think that may play out in a couple of near-term approvals in terms of what happens. I also think there are some opportunities here for innovation even beyond paying over time. For example, there are companies that have franchises in these areas. And one could see, and I've had some very early discussions with some of these companies, maybe the price does include existing therapy like factor. So one could see an agreement where we're paying a certain amount for gene therapy, paying over time. And if the company makes a gene therapy and makes other drugs, and again, factor would be an example for hemophiliac, perhaps a factor is included at no additional cost. And it's framed less as a failure and more as an outcomes guarantee in terms of whatever is needed to control that patient's bleeding. There's other innovation opportunities here as well. So I was in a discussion around sickle cell just last week with a group, and we were talking about the fact that for existing patients who are maybe in their 30s and 40s, they may have joint damage and other things. For those who are diagnosed early, newborns, for example, there's much greater value because you don't have that existing disease. And it raised the question, and it's an interesting one, do you actually have age-specific pricing? Now, you could overly complicate that, and I've been accused, particularly by the people who I work with, who I create a lot of work for, of doing so. But one could imagine that you had a price for those who are newborn or young and don't have any complications, and a second price for those who are older and do have complications. And again, that's a way to get around the question of, is the therapy fair value? Because in this case, it's clear that there are different value propositions for different groups. So I'd encourage all of you to think about that as well. Other challenges, barriers, portability. So if we're trying to do multi-year agreements, how does that actually work in a system that is not single payer? And, and that is, again, a real challenge that we need to address. And there's a couple of ways to get around that. One is, and if you think about what we did with Spark, and this is what we will do in the absence of any solutions, we'll enter into upfront agreements with some flow of dollars downstream, again, in many cases limited by Medicare best price, and agree that over time we will continue to be on the other end of that agreement, even if the patient leaves Harvard Pilgrim. Now that is not a great solution, but it is better than paying the entire amount up front with nothing at risk or no rebate for based on outcomes, et cetera, regardless of what happens. So, that's something we can work around, but it's imperfect. There are discussions underway. I don't know if people are familiar with the MIT Nudix group. They met last week, and there's been a lot of discussion there about creating at least a test environment in Massachusetts where payers pretty much play well together. And it occurred to me about a year ago that if you define churn as leaving Harvard Pilgrim, it is a certain percentage. But if you find churn as actually moving out of the state, as opposed to having your employer or yourself go with a different insurer, it's far less. So the question was, could we come up with an agreement with the major commercial insurers for what might call an import-export agreement? We'll take your liabilities if you take ours. Let's agree on common measures and the like. So we've been having discussions. The major barrier to that is actually, not surprising, the Medicare best pricing, as well as some frustration among some of the payers around the outcome measures, since we need to agree on common outcome measures. We can't collaborate on price, although I think that really isn't a barrier, because I'm pretty sure the companies are going to come to us with a price that they're offering to everyone versus cutting individual deals. So I think that's doable, and a lot of people elsewhere are watching it, but the best price legislation is right now the biggest barrier to moving forward. In terms of other challenges beyond that, I will say that the fact that half the employers that we have are self-insured, and some of the larger payers actually have a higher percentage. They have issues around reinsurance, which I won't get into in details, but that may be a challenging solution for them as well, because I can't get all of the employers to agree to take the liabilities. So there's other models being talked about. I'll just briefly say one model that's been put out there is what some call an orphan benefit reinsurance model. Could be a third party, which is commercial. It could be some sort of government fund, but that's something where everyone could pay into it, perhaps on a PMPM to cover certain gene therapies, and that fund or company pays over time and negotiates these. That would get around the portability issues. You'd still have the best price challenges, but again, I think we're going to solve that. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to change things and to improve and to solve the barriers. But I do believe it's going to take a couple of launches and our ability to demonstrate to various stakeholders why these are issues and why they need to be solved. So I'll end my prepared comments there and open that up to questions. I'll take questions now, since again I do need to leave midway through. So I'll take a couple of questions. Anything? Yes.
So about the portability, so when a patient moves and you're still paying, how do you follow up what the treatment is still working?
That's a great question, and it's one of those things that you think about in the abstract, and then when you start to put together an agreement, you think about that in a lot differently. And I was more concerned about that previously. We've done a lot of value-based agreements for many different drugs, and I used to think that they needed to be scalable, something we could get from a claim sheet. And I've changed my perspective on that. I think where we will get the most benefit, and the companies will get the most benefit, are for the high-cost therapies, the CAR-Ts, the gene therapies we're talking about here, rare diseases. And in those cases, many of the outcome measures may be a little challenging to get. However, if we have an agreement with a company for a $1.5 to $2 million or more therapy with a whole lot at risk, 60, 80%, whatever, I can have a staff member assigned to tracking down the patient, calling them, speaking to the physician, et cetera. So at least in the near term, where a lot of these are for less common conditions, that's doable. Second point I would make is that my understanding, you understand the FDA requirements better than I do, but my understanding is they're requiring for a number of years, I think at least 5, and I've heard numbers that are longer, for the gene therapy companies to collect data on the efficacy and safety. So it strikes me that if we're agreeing with the companies to certain outcome measures, just have the companies measure them because they're going to have to track the patients. And then finally, there are some third parties, some large entities, and I think Steve Miller may touch on this, but there are a number of them that are putting together different entities that could help manage these and help the system work for many of the smaller payers and others that may not have the capacity or the human capital. So I don't think that's a deal breaker, but it's a great question. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, some of the other payers are less vocal, and how are they thinking about this? And again, we are kind of at the cutting edge. Sometimes we may be getting a little far over our skis, but we're out there. And let me give you a data point here. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of concern about the PCSK9s. Do people remember those high-cost cholesterol drugs? And I can't tell you how much time I spent and my colleagues spent looking at them, putting restrictions in place, modeling again, speaking to our CFO, and everyone kind of had Hep C hangover. Now, I will tell you that our current run rate on PCSK9s for our insured population is under $2 million a year. And again, it's going up with some outcomes data, and there's many reasons for that, which I won't get into now. That's likely to be less than the cost of one patient getting a gene therapy. So is it, should I be paying a lot of attention to these new therapies and coming out with innovative? Absolutely. I think the issue for many payers, though, is that they're all really busy, and like everyone, we can't keep up with the current demand to review new tests, molecular diagnostics, drugs, et cetera. So I think many companies are challenged. It's tough to get attention, and again, we find this interesting. We're very involved here, but for a typical payer, especially the smaller ones that don't have as much capacity. So if you're a large payer, you might have 1 or 2 people focused on this, but the smaller ones, which are many in terms of the number of payers, as smaller as a percentage of the population, again, just don't have the people to put on this. So they're less likely to meet with gene therapy companies and to model it out, and they're going to pay attention maybe when it's a few months out and they have to worry about the budget impact. But they're also watching companies like ours and Cigna, Express Scripts, and others, and I think they're taking their cue and figuring as long as someone's thinking about these, they'll be able to be a part of it. Even using that MIT Newdig's example, we were the primary payer at the table. When we kind of shook everyone up and said, would you join us and talk about how to do this? 2 of the other larger commercial payers, actually, so now we have all the 3 of the largest, came and said, we'll send someone, we'll talk about this. So when asked, they stepped up. And then the other 2, the 4th and 5th in terms of size, and this isn't surprising, said, we're kind of busy, we don't really have time for this, but when you get traction and you're about to do something, give us a call and we'll join in and see what we can do.
Terrific. Could you mentioned, Michael, quality adjusted life years, and I was on a panel, as I mentioned earlier yesterday, and there was a bit of a discussion about their utility, the appropriateness of them. Apparently, Secretary Azar recently weighed in and said, look, I think they're perfectly fine in private plans where people can vote with their feet if they want to leave, but they're inappropriate in Medicaid and public plans because people can't leave. So just maybe you could unpack your thinking for us all on quality adjusted life years, their utility, the pluses and minuses of.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll try to do it somewhat briefly. I think there's 2 points embedded there. The, the one that answers the question less directly, but I think is important, I've heard that before in a meeting with Seema Verma about the fact people can move around among plans, but they can't move out of the public payer. It's still, it doesn't change the question about what is a fair price, because again, the Medicaid plans, which people may not be able to leave, they still have to cover the costs. And if we can't figure out a fair price, and this is all about getting, the whole discussion really is about imputing what is a fair starting price. And if we can't get there and that becomes a barrier to people getting drugs, that's a bad thing for everyone. And again, if you're in industry, if we can't solve this, there is the specter, and depends on what happens in the next election, of significant legislation. Right now we're seeing a lot of discussions around transparency and others. I testified in the Massachusetts State House recently, and some of the advocacy groups were pretty adamant, and even in cases where actually the pricing was fair. I was a little surprised some of the examples. You get some elderly individuals in talking about their cost share, and it's very compelling to the legislators. And in some cases, they were for drugs that actually ICER said is fair value. So I'm concerned about that, and I think you should all be more concerned. But the question more directly around how do you determine what is fair? As I said, a dollar number in itself is in a vacuum. I shouldn't be reacting to that. I should be thinking about what is the best way to get to high quality, what is the lowest cost way to get there in terms of total cost of care, and if the costs go up, what is the right slope that's fair for all parties? And the whole ICER approach is trying to get to that by, at an upper limit, suggesting that drugs that are priced at no more than $150,000 per quality just of life year, are fair. Now, one of the concerns that's been expressed, and this is a fair concern, is if you're talking about quality adjusted life years, in many cases, particularly for those who may not be newborns but may have some ongoing sequelae of the disease, you're not going to get a full quality adjusted life year. In other words, it's partial. And again, in some cases, these will slow progression but not ultimately get people to full health. So the question is, do qualities actually discriminate against those who are disabled? And again, it's not a crazy argument, it's a fair point. And for that reason, ICER, to their credit, and they've heard this from many of us, including myself, looked at what they're calling life year gained. So when they looked at that for example, Zolgensma, which just came out, the SMA gene therapy, the numbers that, and I'm going to give you the high end, was 1.5 million. It was actually 900,000 to 1.5 million per life year gained. If you use quality adjusted life years, you got a far smaller number, because in many cases you're not getting kind of a 1.0 on the quality modifier. And I'm perfectly comfortable looking at the life years gained and saying, let's not risk discriminating against individuals. Let's just look at it at flat life year gained. But again, it's important to use something like that to try to impute a fair price. Right now there's a small number of drugs, but again, we're looking at some indications which can be broader, and rare disease collectively aren't that rare. And we run the risk that in 5 to 10 years, maybe not in 2 to 3, but 5 to 10, we'll see limits on our ability to spend, which may create other types of constraints. I think this is really important. Well, thank you, and I'll turn it over to them.
Wanted to ask
one
one
more
last question. Just if you could advise, I guess, the companies in the room, if they're interested in exploring outcomes-based payment arrangements, contracting strategies, when's the best time to come and engage with payers?
That is a great question, and I think to some extent it depends on the payers. And if you're talking about the larger entities, which again have more capacity, or the smaller ones like mine, which have shown a willingness to come to the table, probably earlier. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. If some of the many others that just may not have the capacity, that have 50 companies trying to meet with them, it's probably pretty close to FDA approval when they have data, and where they can go to them to support the the development of a clinical policy, which the payers are interested in. For those of us who are kind of more on the innovative front end, we meet certainly, and again, we have capacity issues, so if we had 50 requests, we wouldn't be able to do this, and I tend to meet personally with companies where I have relationships and I know the people. Again, if you read the press, you think that payers and PBMs and pharma hate each other, and maybe some do, but when I sit down, there's good and bad actors, but when I sit down with the companies and they start talking about what's important and the data, the unmet need, and the patients they're helping, you develop that common understanding and that shared true north, and you start working towards solutions, and that to me is a fun part of why I do what I do. But we sit down frequently with companies that are even 1 or 2 years out when they're asking what kind of data should we come to you, how do we think about multi-year agreements. In many cases there's companies, and I won't name them, but that we've had some interesting conflict with before over data that are now coming to us saying, we get that there's going to be challenges if we can't pay over multiple years. Help us think about it. How can we set up our infrastructure, our pilots, our data, so when we come to you, we'll be able to do this. So in that case, it could be even 1 to 2 years.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sherman. Okay, so I'm going to introduce each of our next 3 speakers, and then we'll have time at the end, about 30, 40 minutes for questions from the audience. So please hold on to them, jot them down, hold on to them, and then we'll have time to address them at the end. So our next speaker is Dr. Steve Miller. He's the Chief Medical Officer of Express Scripts and also of Cigna after the ESI acquisition. Obviously, very involved in distribution, specialty pharmacy, and have worked with both Spark and Novartis as they have launched their gene and cell therapies. A lot of discussion about novel and innovative ways to both distribute and develop innovative payment mechanisms. Also, as Chief Medical Officer of one of the largest PBMs, very much involved in the more recent drug pricing discussions. So Steve will be speaking next and discuss his experience there as well. After Steve, we'll have Joe Barge, who's the Chief Legal Officer of Spark. Obviously, Spark has led the way with the first approval of gene therapy in the United States and has pioneered both innovative market access programs and contracting arrangements. So we look forward to hearing about sort of the lessons learned from their experience. And then finally, we'll have Mark Skinner, who is the President and CEO for Policy Advancement Ltd. He's a leading hemophilia expert in the field and has certainly been working more recently on frameworks to evaluate gene therapies for hemophilia. So I invite Dr. Miller to present, and then we'll go through the next speakers and have the panel.
Great, thank you all for being here this morning. So as you heard, I'm Steve Miller. I'm with Cigna and Express Scripts. I'm a kidney transplant doctor, and I tell you that mainly because it has relevance to what we're doing today. So if you remember back in the 60s, when dialysis was becoming really common, there was essentially no way to pay for it. If you think about the cost of dialysis at the time, there was a big burden. And so when the country under Nixon was considering the end-stage renal disease bill, they actually took a dialysis patient to Capitol Hill, and they essentially told Congress, if you don't fund this, we're going to unplug this person will die in front of you. It was somewhat dramatic and, of course, a bit not real. But the Congress debated the end-stage renal disease bill for about 15 minutes. And they passed a bill when they were told that only 14,000 people would ever be on end-stage renal disease treatment. And as you know now, there's over 400,000 people that get treatment through the government program. And so the government was fooled once, and you would think, well, they're not going to do that again. They're not going to cover a disease. But then, if many of you remember in the 80s with the AIDS epidemic, the cost of treating an AIDS patient was often over $250,000 a year. And the federal government actually stepped up, and they passed the Ryan White Title IX plan, which would fund the treatment for HIV. And again, that ballooned to a level that they never anticipated. So the government has been fooled on several occasions to be the backstop for expensive disease therapy. And the question is, are they going to step up a third time when it comes to gene therapy? And my assessment is, don't count on it. Fool them once, shame on you. Fool them twice, shame on me. And so I think what you're going to see is we're in a very interesting time, and you saw Tim had some of these headlines. You know, this is really, really exciting stuff. And we, as a medical community, need to make sure these products get into the hands of patients. But, you know, when you think about the excitement on the good, the scientific greatness that this is going to represent for patients, on the bad side is how are we going to afford it? And so when you think about the U.S. healthcare system, we spend about $3.5 trillion on an annual basis. You know, it's an inconceivable amount of money. And the question is, can we fit this into the budget? And I actually am a real optimist. With $3.5 trillion, we don't have a lack of money in the U.S. healthcare system. We may allocate that money poorly, but we actually have in this country more than enough capacity to pay for these new products to come to the marketplace, especially when you consider that all the studies show that about a third of that is wasted. So we're wasting over $1 trillion on an annual basis, and I will guarantee you that gene therapy is not going to get to $1 trillion of cost. And so the reality is there's enough money in the U.S. healthcare system. We just got to figure out how do we drive out that waste and how do we pay for the things that we want. And Michael alluded to this before, but I want you to have the perspective of the payer community, especially when it comes to drugs. If you look at the donut on the left, in 2016, the United States was spending about $350 billion on an annual basis for pharmaceuticals. And if you look at the light versus the dark represents patients on specialty medications. That's 1 to 4% of the population, depending on your plan. That 1 to 4% of the population was using a little over a third of the dollars. You fast forward to 2019. In 2019, we spent $480 billion on pharmaceuticals. That 1 to 4% of the population had not changed. There's still 1 to 4% of a plan's population, but they're now accounting for almost 50% of drug spend. So for 4% of the people, we're spending 50% of the dollars. For the other 96% of the people, we're spending 50% of the dollars. This is what has plan sponsors concerned. It's this rapid rise of specialty spend. And as Michael pointed out, you know, I don't care if it's 100% of healthcare spend if it cured people. There's not a right or wrong number of how much we should be spending on drugs. We want to spend on the right things to do the right things for patients. But this is how plans are looking at it, is their spend's going up dramatically, and if you look at what the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry is doing, everything you're bringing to the marketplace, for the most part, is for a rare disease. The business model has totally flipped. Prior to 2010, most of the FDA approvals were traditional oral solid drugs, diabetes, hypertension, osteoporosis. After 2010, the model had flipped where almost all the approvals at the FDA are now for rare and orphan diseases. And so as you see on this slide, the number of those treatments keeps going up, and the price point that they come to the marketplace keeps going up. In the last 2 years, there has not been a single cancer product introduced in the marketplace for less than $100,000. So when you tell the marketplace, oh, we price this based on the value of our drug, our R&D costs, our production costs, well, it's amazing that everyone seems to have the exact R&D costs, production costs, discovery costs. And so we need to make sure that we're explaining to people how this is. And here's the worst case. This is all the gene and cell therapies that have been introduced worldwide. And I want to explain a couple of them. So some of them, many of you in this room will have heard of, but most of the population hasn't heard of. If you look at the far left, Glybera, for lipoprotein lipase dystrophy, introduced in Europe at a price that was equivalent to about $1.6 million per patient. Now, it wasn't the greatest therapy, but it worked. And they set up centers of excellence, many of the things you all are thinking of. They tried to get the European patients to come to just a few centers. It turned out the payers didn't want to pay for it, and the product failed. It's no longer available. Second product introduced in the market is Strimvelis. Strimvelis was also introduced in Europe. It's for SCIDs, severe combined immune deficiency. Again, not the greatest product, priced a little bit lower, but what you see is, again, the payers wouldn't cover it, and this product has also failed. And so the first two introductions of genes and cell therapies in the world actually were failures. Now, in the United States, we've had 3 products introduced, LuxAeterna, Kymriah, and Yescarta. And so far, these products are succeeding. But what I'm here to say is we have got to work together because we owe it to patients and to families to make sure these products get into the marketplace and that they survive in the marketplace. So working together, we're going to have to figure out what can we learn from these failures and what can we do differently in the United States that is going to make these products be successful. And we'll talk about a few of these products as we go a little further. And as you know, and as Tim already said, the science is unbelievable. You know, when I was in medical school, none of these terms were being used. None of them. You look now, and we're coming up with new classes of therapy on a frequent basis, and these therapies are just spectacular. And so we are at the time where we can actually make a huge difference. And you look at these numbers, these are actually drugs that are in either phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. So these are in humans today. And that number is not insubstantial. You're talking about over 1,000 products of advanced type therapies that are in clinical trials in the United States today. And so when you think about what you as a biotech or pharma company and what I as a payer need, we have a lot of overlap. We are not at the opposite ends of the spectrum on this. We actually all need to figure out how are we going to take care of access so we get people on these drugs in a timely fashion. How are we going to take care of affordability? What's the clinical care going to be, and how do we help steward these patients to the best outcome? If we're going to be paying for the drugs and paying these high prices, how do we get the maximum outcome that we can from these? And so you and I are actually quite aligned in this. And we have developed a lot of tools to support you in successful commercialization. So Michael talked about the big players. I'm a really big player. Our company, between Cigna, Express Scripts, and Evacor, we touch 160 million lives in America every year. So when you talk about our population and the influence we can have to make sure these things get into the hands of patients, we actually can not only influence it for a lot of patients, but we need to build the infrastructure that makes this work. So Michael talked about some of the tools that we have, and I'm going to use some case studies. But we've set up a model that we think is unique in the marketplace. Number one, it's on the foundation of specialized clinical care. We are possessed that these patients not only need to have the best care prior to the gene therapy, but they need to have the best care going forward, because we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So we've created what we call therapeutic resource centers. These are centers of specialized excellence where we have pharmacists, nurses, social workers, dietitians who specialize in the diseases that we're treating. And so if you think about if your child had cancer, God forbid, you would take your child to the best pediatric oncologist you could find. Why would you want your pharmacist or your social worker or your nurse to be any less well-trained? You would want them to have access to the best care possible. And so we've created this, and we've created it across 23 different diseases. We have it in bleeding disorders. We have it in cardiovascular, diabetes, other things. We have a specialized gene therapy therapeutic resource center where our people are trained just to handle the gene therapies. The second, for the payer communities, they're going to want a second opinion. Now, many times your patients are actually going to be in the very best center they can be in anyway. And so you're wondering why they want the second opinion. It turns out reinsurance often won't even pay without a second opinion. And so it has to be a service that's available that can be quickly obtained to make sure that the patient's getting the right recommendations. Third is we have got to manage the drug costs. And we'll come back to this because this is a big issue. What should your drug be priced at, especially if you want certainty of payment? If you think about it, as a company, many of you who've never commercialized a product, your number one issue is going to be certainty of payment. That's what failed in Europe. They did not have certainty of payment. And if you can't make sure you're going to get reimbursed, it's going to be very hard to dispense that product. And finally, we're going to have to figure out what we call financial protection. What does that look like? How are we going to make sure that individual plans can afford this? Part of the problem with this is that if you think about the bucket, we talked about the drug spend last year was $480 billion. Gene therapy actually can fit into that bucket pretty well. Let's just say gene therapy was 10% of it. It was $4.8 billion. You all would love to have a $48 billion industry. We should be able to fit that in the bucket. The question is, how do we do it? Because part of the problem is that your diseases are not evenly spread across the population. You're going to have families working that are covered by a particular company, and you're going to see headlines even this summer. We have a family who has 3 people with the same orphan disease. A couple of years ago, there was no treatment for them. Treatment comes out, it's $1.5 million per patient per year. Now, unlike a gene therapy, it's an ongoing treatment that they're going to need for the rest of their life. That company, that small employer, now has $4.5 million of new expense. That small company has a choice. They may go out of business, or they may kick everyone off insurance and push them out to the exchanges, because they can't survive this. And this is going to be the same story you're going to see with gene therapy, because it's not going to be evenly distributed, so we got to figure out what does financial protection looks like. So let me give you a couple of examples. Sparks is here with us on the panel, but we work very closely with Sparks, and this will get to some of the tools that we've created in the marketplace to help make sure we can hold down the costs. So you know that they treat a disease called Leber syndrome. It's a very unfortunate disease. Child's born with normal vision. The vision deteriorates over time. If the doctor diagnoses the disease, which is not easy to do, if you get to the right doctor, you diagnose it, the doctor can actually treat this disease with a gene therapy that's injected into the back of the eye, and it stabilizes the vision. Now, it's not supposed to improve the vision, it's supposed to stabilize the vision, but I will tell you, having treated these patients, we're seeing some remarkable results. We've had a young woman who couldn't get a driver's license. She's now gotten a driver's license. I mean, it's truly life-changing for these patients. If you think about what's the challenge Sparks had to get this drug into the OR to treat these patients. If they sold it to the hospital would take their $425,000 drug per eye, and they'd mark it up to $800,000, because that's what hospitals do with drugs, is they mark them up. What we did for Sparks is we developed a delivery model where we could actually deliver to the OR with a patient-specific label, and the hospital never takes it into inventory. That way, Sparks gets all the value for the innovation that they put into it. The hospital has agreed to accept the product through our specialty distribution to their OR, and this way we're able to hold down the costs, improve the care, and make sure that there's more certainty of payment. So this is actually one of those innovative things where we've built a model that is different than what's in the marketplace. And it's because we have these specialized pharmacies, we have specialty distribution, and so we're able to do things above and beyond. And like Michael said, we can now annuitize payments, we can do lump sum payments, we even believe we can add portability over time. I want to use a different example. This is not a gene therapy, but this is an example of, you all heard about the migraine drugs that came to the marketplace. Huge breakthrough for those patients with migraines. As you know, this affects a huge part of the population. When Amgen was going to come out with this product, they initially floated a price out there that was quite high. We went out to visit Amgen. We said, listen, if you do that, the trouble is that payers are going to erect barriers just like they did for the PCSK9s. You may want to come in at a lower price, because then you have fewer barriers. And Michael touched on this point, but I've got to reiterate this. How you price your drug, your introductory price, will actually result in how much barrier people put in front of you. And so they actually lowered the price. They brought it out at a much lower price, but they went on to also guarantee the outcome. If the patient didn't respond to the therapy, at least with us, we were going to refund the money to the patient, to the plan sponsor. And so this was a guarantee that the product worked. So not only did we get an attractive price, we got a money-back guarantee for the product when it didn't work. And so this actually, if you look at their launch and how successful it is, unlike the PCSK9s that fought for access and didn't get to many of the patients they wanted to get to, these products are being rapidly adopted and patients are benefiting from it because it's working for both the plan sponsors, the patients, and Amgen. As you know, the Avexis product is soon to launch. You've heard price proposals out there is up to $4 million. We don't know exactly what their price is going to be. We've been working closely with them. We're trying to come up with innovative models to help them launch this. But this is going to be a particular challenge for everyone in this room. This product's going to be very expensive, but unlike most products, these kids are on a clock. As you know, if you don't treat these kids early in life, they actually go on to die. There's a 100% mortality rate by 2 years. But the drug, because of the trials, they treated these patients in a fairly narrow window. And so every day you wait, the patient becomes a little less eligible for the product. And unfortunately, there's only 400,000 kids that are born with this each year. 400 kids born with this each year, but half of those kids are covered by Medicaid. That means you have 50 states. And one of the points you got to understand is when you come to market, you're dealing with 3 different payer systems in the United States. You're dealing with commercial, you're dealing with Medicare, and you're dealing with Medicaid. And you have to have a strategy that is specific for each of those payers. Now with Medicaid, it's even worse. It's not one program, it's 50 programs. And so you're going to have kids that are born who are identified who have spinal muscular atrophy. You're going to be on a clock, which if you don't get approval for the payment in a certain time, the kid's no longer going to be eligible for the treatment. And so you could imagine the newspaper and the watch that's going to be going on for these kids. And this is going to actually put increased scrutiny on all of us in this room. Because the question is, are we heartless people that aren't just care about the money, or are we going to make sure the kids get access to these things? Because this may potentially be curative for life. And so this is really an exciting therapy. And so obviously the higher the price, the bigger the problem. But the company also has very few patients to amortize this over. And so we are going to have to figure out how to solve this together. Which gets me to the next point, and that is, how do you price your product and how do you value your product? As we said, we believe that in oncology, everyone's pricing it over $100,000. Their developmental costs, their discovery costs aren't equal, yet they're showing no price discrimination. And so if you want payers to actually be accepting to your products, how do you actually come in with a story and statistics, numbers that actually show what the value of that product is? There are several different organizations that do this around the world. NICE is very clear, and the interesting thing in Europe is when NICE says they're not going to cover your product, they just don't cover the product. And so it is not much of a negotiation. They essentially are price setting, and they've been successful doing that. Now, they don't give you access to everything in Europe. If you look at cancer products, many of those cancer products that we cover in the United States don't get covered in Europe. And patients who have money come to the United States to get those therapies. Is that going to be the same thing that happens in gene therapy? Are they going to choose not to cover them and let people who have resources come to another country to access them? In the United States, we've seen the development of something called ICER. ICER is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They have been doing modeling and trying to put cost effectiveness on the products. What I'm asking you to do is, as a community, you all have got to figure out a framework. I would love to see a framework which the whole community could agree to. Because if you do that, I can probably help you with certainty of payment. But until we have that, it's going to be really hard to be able to tell you I can give you certainty of payment. And so we can probably get the payer community there if there was some convention by which we all looked at how to value these things. But the haphazard approach that we're taking today is probably going to not be workable, and you're going to see a lot of controversy in the marketplace. I'm going to end here with the following thoughts, and that is these breakthrough treatments are really game changers. We have got to be as innovative on the payment side as you all are being on the science side. And so that's why we're trying to build infrastructure that's going to help you be successful at commercializing these things. But there are going to be no easy answers to this. I know that we have the financial resources in this country to pay for it. I am totally committed to the fact that we can actually do this. We have just got to work together to do this. And you all are going to have to do something painful on your side too. And that's not just to innovate on the science. You're really going to have to think about how you want to price these things. And you're going to have economic models that make it work. And if we're committed to doing this together, I believe that we can be successful to provide access and patient care. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Good morning, everybody. Oop. Right, there we go. There we go. Great. Happy to be here with you guys today. Share a little bit about the Spark story, focused mostly on LuxAeterna and some of the key learnings that we've had as launching the first approved gene therapy for genetic disease in the United States. As Steve indicated, following in the path of Glybera and Strimbelis, the pressure was on to make sure that we could establish a business model that actually worked for gene therapy and that set the stage for additional therapies to come. Let's get through that. Just a little bit about Spark. We're about 5-6 years old. We're spun out of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I'm going to spend the time, as indicated today, talking mostly about the first bar up there around LuxAeterna and what we've done on the commercial side. But the rest of, we're working on a lot of other therapies as well. And so getting the commercial model right here is incredibly important, not only for us as a company, but for the industry generally. So LuxAeterna, as Steve indicated, LuxAeterna is a gene therapy for a specific gene mutation caused by the RPE65 gene. It's a inherited retinal disease. It's more commonly and historically known with clinical diagnoses as Leber's congenital amaurosis and a specific subtype of retinitis pigmentosa. The challenge here is this is the first approved therapy, any therapy for inherited retinal disease. So we have to find these patients. These patients are not in the system, and as Michael indicated, there's no cost offsets here. So we're not replacing any other drug. We are, in many respects, changing these people's lives by giving them their sight back, but we are not offsetting an existing drug that they're on that's costing some annual cost to the healthcare system. A couple key attributes of LuxAeterna. We were successful in getting a genetic label with FDA. So unlike a drug that is for a specific clinical diagnosis, this was tied to a genetic test that shows that you are positive for this genetic mutation. I think from a commercial perspective and talking to payers, that was important. The payers clearly don't have to be concerned about off-label use here. You either had the genetic mutation or you don't. And there's a lot of discretion left to the doctor or the physician around the appropriate treatment of the patient, whether they have the other attributes that will make this therapy successful, such as viable retinal cells. So as we launched LuxAeterna, we really thought about kind of 3 different payment models, and the core concepts or the core principles that we tried to adhere to were one, rapid coverage for patients and broad access for patients. We wanted to ensure that payers knew what they were going to be paying and that they would have certainty of that. And we wanted to remove some of the uncertainty for the hospital systems in terms of having to buy the drug and potentially pass that on to the payers and not knowing whether or not they would get reimbursed. So we really came up with 3 models: an innovative contracting model, which I'll talk about, an outcomes-based rebate arrangement, and then really setting the stage and speaking with CMS and others about what needs to change for the future to really make these models successful. So we have an innovative contracting and distribution model that Steve mentioned and Michael mentioned. It's a unique model that increases the focus on patient care by ensuring access. So what we do in a very simple level is, instead of contracting with a treatment center directly, we call the Michaels of the world and we talk to Michael and say, we have our drug, we want you to cover it. We enter into an agreement with the payer to cover the drug at our cost, and the advantages to the payer are that they know what they're getting the drug for. In the typical buy and bill model, where we would sell the product to the hospital, The hospital can buy that drug typically at a almost 20% discount, be able to then mark that drug up and sell or bill Michael for the cost of that drug. So that gives Michael certainty of what he knows he's going to pay, and it removes the uncertainty from the treatment center of whether or not Michael's actually going to cover the drug. In exchange for that, we're able to talk to the health plan, make sure that they have the necessary tools in place to ensure that patients get rapid coverage, that they aren't put on extended pre-authorization periods, that we can get those patients in to treat them quickly. And then we have set up a number of patient support programs where we're actually helping to cover co-pays and out-of-pocket costs for those patients to get them to the treatment centers and treated. So after we've reached agreement with that payer, the payer then turns around and goes and talks to the treatment center. This is the part of the process that Spark actually is involved in, but the payer will actually talk to the treatment center and figure out what the appropriate reimbursement level for delivering the drug to the patient is. So the payer works with the treatment center, we work with the payer, and then we use Steve and companies like Steve to help us get the drug to the hospital and just in time for the patient as they come to the center. There's clearly distribution challenges that you need to be thinking of as you think about shipping your drug. Our drug needs to be shipped at 80 degrees below zero, minus 80. So you have cold chain distribution issues. You've got issues of making sure that the treatment centers know what to do with that drug when they get it. There's a pharmacy process that needs to be implemented. And so one of the things that we thought about when launching this drug was, as opposed to taking the drug to every patient, we thought about it really from the perspective of bringing the patient to the drug. So we identified, right now about a dozen or so what we call retinal treatment centers. These are, highly specialized academic medical centers that have retinal specialists at their facilities that are specifically trained for administration of the drug. And then our patient services team works with identified patients to get those patients to an appropriate center, as opposed to, the traditional model where you might ship the drug directly to any retinal specialist that might be the closest one to each patient. So the other element that we instituted when we rolled LuxAeterna out was to really look to stand behind the therapy. There are a lot of shortcomings still in the system that limit our ability to do this, but what we have been able to do is structure both a short-term and a long-term durability measure that is tied to the performance of LuxAeterna. So LuxAeterna is administered. Within 30 days, that patient is assessed. If the patient has a treatment failure, we will rebate up to 20% of the cost of the therapy back to the payer. If the treatment works, we then are able to go out 30 months beyond that and again bring the patient in. And if the patient still has a clinical benefit, the payment remains, and if they have a decrease in their clinical benefit, again, we will rebate up to 20% of the cost. We'd like to be able to do more, as Michael indicated when we've talked to them, but we are limited by a number of federal regulations that would severely impact our overall business if we were to discount more than 20%. And one of the things I think is also important to think about here are what your outcome measures are. Michael indicated in talking to a number of companies and what may have been used in a clinical trial and what might be used in the commercial context. I don't have the video with me, but for LuxAeterna in our clinical trial, we used a multi-luminescence mobility test. And if you've seen the videos, this is actually almost like a maze that's set up on the floor, and we run that patient through that maze at various light levels. Well, as you can imagine, that setup is not really conducive to the commercial context. We really can't roll that out in a controlled setting at every treatment center and bring patients to run them through that to see whether or not, A, the treatment has worked, and B, whether it's durable. However, and I think this is where it's important as you're going through clinical trials to be thinking about what other measures might correlate to your primary endpoint? What else can you test in that clinical trial that might be more adaptable to the commercial context? And so in this circumstance, we were able to identify a test called full field light sensitivity. I will say still a lot of complexity. That is a machine that not every center has. So you need to make sure that as you think about these things, that your treatment center has a machine if you need that to test for the outcome. Is that machine calibrated correctly? Are all the machines running the same protocol? And so you have consistency. But at least in this circumstance, we were able to identify something in the commercial context that was going to be scalable. There are other therapies like hemophilia or otherwise that I think may be simpler with a blood test, but depending on the therapeutic area that you're going after, you do want to give some thought to what your outcome measure is going to be and making sure that it is actually commercially capable of being rolled out. So I think the third component of that we really thought about here was, and this is really just expanding upon the concept of pay for performance and value-based pricing arrangements. As he indicated, we were able to structure under the current regulations a situation where we can provide up to 20% or so rebate off the cost of the drug. But we really felt that in order for this commercial model in gene therapies where you are going to have potentially high-cost therapies, we need to be able to do more than 20%. And ideally, we would look to be able to structure outcome-based arrangements that were in the form of installment payments to address that high upfront cost. And so in order to do this, we've been in extensive discussions with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, with HHS, over the last 18 months. I think what I would say is we're encouraged, as Michael also indicated, about the dialogue that we're having there, but getting to the finish line is still a challenge. And I think what we need to do is create the right structures in place that enable both installments or rebates over time that are tied to outcomes. So you're only paying for the therapy if the therapy actually works. And so and I think we'll probably talk about this as a group, but I think there are a number of things, both on the regulatory side, whether it is amendments to the regulations around the Medicaid best price rule, or how you calculate average manufacturer price, or whether it is actually legislation that might enable these gene therapies to be structured in installment or rebate situations to encourage more therapies as they come to market. I think that's it.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So, good morning. It's great to be here. I come from the patient perspective, and so I want to share you a little bit about how patients can actively engage with payers, with stakeholders, with regulators to try to define value and hopefully influence the value proposition so that the right therapies reach the right patients at the right time. By way of disclosures, probably a couple things of note. I do serve on the governing board of ICER. I was invited to join them a couple years ago, I guess about a year and a half ago, as a patient. And I also do some work with a number of the gene therapy companies, including Spark and Pfizer on their data safety boards, and helping BioMarin and Unicure develop their outcomes programs. So this is my life when I was born in 1960. Hemophilia was a disease where the life expectancy was somewhere in the 20s, early 30s. So today I'm 58 years old. So obviously I've beat those odds and science has advanced enormously. Hemophilia is a bleeding disorder where your blood is lacking an essential protein that allows the blood to clot normally. Typically, the worst manifestations are internal bleeding into the joints. It leads to crippling arthropathy. I had my 13th orthopedic surgery just 2 months ago, which really allows me to stand here and talk with you today. So long periods of isolation in childhood. And although we've made great progress in the developed world, this still is the picture of what's happening in the rest of the world. And I would hope as we think about gene therapy, we don't forget that there's a huge population out there that may not yet benefit, and we need to find ways and have the same pricing and value discussions and how we bring those to the rest of the world. So this is simply the progress, and we are on the cusp. There are about 9 companies that I know of are in active gene therapy trials in one form or another using one vector or a different one, and it seems tantalizingly close for us. There's a lot of knowns, there's a lot of unknowns, there's things that we still don't know, but it comes to us, unlike LuxAeterna, it comes to the population where an existing therapy actually exists. And that does change the discussion, it changes the paradigm, the conversation that we're going to have between clinicians and patients, the conversation that we're going to have with payers, and the way regulators are going to think about the risk that's acceptable for patients to accept when there is an alternative, albeit imperfect. So the perspective of how we begin to think about value really matters. I could be the man standing on the island looking to be saved. Could be the man cast at sea in the boat looking for land. But whatever perspective you have, it is important to recognize that the patient perspective is unique, and it probably is different than the way many of you have thought about it. So this actually is a quote from the FDA. It was a quote that they used at the launch of the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, I guess now 5 or 6 years ago, and I think it's sort of been the hallmark of what the FDA has been trying to do to enhance the patient voice within the regulatory program. So as I think about the value proposition, or what value in healthcare is, I like the work of Mike Porter, a Harvard economist. He's been thinking about this for quite a while, published widely, and his work sort of goes back to 2010. Typically, the kind of thing that is tracked in clinical trials, that is tracked in the clinical setting, are those things that can be counted, the hard numbers that really are easy to quantify. But what really matters, and what matters to me as a patient, are things that allow me to function in life. The quality of life, something that would allow me to go to school, to get an education I would like, to get a job, to support a family, and to participate in life. Those are not the things that we measure. And so we may be treating an arbitrary number that really is not a solution. And that becomes particularly important when a drug already exists in a therapy, is what's being left on the table, what's not being considered in the value proposition. So what we wanted to do, and I was one of the 3 core investigators that worked on this, is in a pre-competitive space, because there is no hemophilia gene therapy on the market now, could we bring together all of the relevant stakeholders to define how would we measure therapies or success for gene therapy relative to the standard of care? We know there's something different about being cured. I expect it to be transformative when I have that opportunity. But certainly it would eliminate a lot of the daily risks of bleeding that I have to go on. So could we develop a core outcome set of measures? And there's a methodology to do this. It's not unique to our thinking. But could we develop a core set of measures that would allow us to differentiate and distinguish a curative technology from the standard of care? So we convened about 75 individuals. It included the 6 largest payers in the U.S. I think the top 6 largest. We had all 7 of the companies at the time that were in the hemophilia gene therapy space, all of our federal partners, including the FDA, the EMA, the Canadian health authorities, CADTH, NICE, ICER, patient organizations, a robust group of all of the stakeholders, and we went through a Delphi process as well as in-person meetings, literature reviews, sort of the typical process to try to define a process. And the general premise is that if every company uses a different standard to measure outcomes, we're going to end up with variable results and inconsistency. It's not only going to serve payers, it's not only not going to serve payers because they're not going to be able to compare and figure out the relative value of one drug versus another. We're not going to have the information to actually serve me as a patient. I'm not going to be able to make a decision whether I want gene therapy A or gene therapy B, or whether gene therapy compared to standard of care is the right thing for me. So could we find a way to select the right elements for clinical trials that would actually span the entire continuum of the drug development process? I think historically it has been a binary process, that you think about market authorization and then you think about market access. And in this scenario, we really think it should expand even further, that if we could develop a set of outcomes that could be collected consistently, that would serve the purposes for market authorization, that would serve purposes for evaluation and the value proposition for market access, and then would serve the purpose for me as a patient when I'm making that shared decision with my clinician, is it right for me? We would advance the field, and hopefully we would reach the decisions with a common understanding of what mattered to each of us. The historical metric within hemophilia has been the annual bleed rate. That's the number of times that I actually have a bleeding episode during the course of the year. Modern therapies have actually lowered that, but it's a subjective number. It's something that I self-report. I may recognize a bleed, I may not. It may be internal. It may still be manifesting in joint damage, but it's not limiting my life. And in fact, often the current therapies don't achieve zero, and we know that every single bleed into a joint, when blood pools, it starts that joint deterioration and damage. And so the historical metric, sort of the legacy metric that we've used, probably isn't the right thing when we're talking about a curative technology, is we're not going to be able to measure it. But one of our challenges as we started talking about advanced therapies is there is a general assumption that life is pretty good with hemophilia. And certainly compared to the 20 years old that I was supposed to reach and now approaching 60, it is remarkable. But as I've explained along the way, I've had significant challenges in terms of orthopedic problems and all of the pain and limitations that come with it. So as patients and clinicians, we first started that maybe we could align, in fact, agree on what we thought the right outcome should be. So we took the leading patient organizations, a group of leading clinicians, and we actually thought we should publish a paper to try to influence the primary endpoints that are used in the clinical trials. And the legacy outcome of annual bleeding rate, we don't believe has the capacity or the sensitivity to give us that right answer to define value and to fully define what is efficacious. But that we need to look something beyond that and actually look at, are we normalizing the level of clotting factor that is circulating in my blood? And perhaps that's a better jumping off point to begin to measure it. And in fact, the reason that we're so fixated on factor activity level is the therapy that I use, the IVs that I would do every other day, that whole concept was designed back in 1962. That was based really on limitations of technology at the time, and we treated to a 1% of normal levels. So that moved somebody with severe hemophilia like myself to a moderately severe state. So I might not be at risk of spontaneous bleeding, but I'm still at risk of chronic arthropathy and other joint damages, and have to make decisions of every aspect of my life about what I'm going to do. Recent research has indicated that I'm really not even, sorry, this is very sensitive, I'm really not free of joint bleeding until I reach at least 15%. Normal is somewhere north of 40%. So as we start thinking about comparing and cost offsets, we have to remember that the cost comparison that we're making may already be based on a suboptimal therapy, and it's not a straight dollar for dollar transition. So we need to find a way to bring some color and add information to that. So the core outcome set really needs to expand beyond those two core clinical metrics to really help us understand what else is going on. The FDA, as part of their patient-focused drug development initiative, launched what's called the Voice of the Patient series. We applied, and we were fortunate to be one of the 24 original disease groups that included all the bleeding disorders, including von Willebrand disease and the rare factor deficiencies, to see if we could come up with and identify what are the outcomes that matter to us as patients. And so this is the summary, and I really quite like the concluding paragraph of the FDA report. We've done a lot, as I've already demonstrated. Clearly things have advanced, but there are still wide areas that need to be addressed in terms of the economic, social, and educational barriers that remain. I have to pick my career very carefully. I had to pick, I wanted to be a lawyer, but I couldn't do some things. I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. If I wanted to pick a job that required me to be on my feet and be manual, those were not career opportunities that were available at the time. And everything from the types of vacations, where you live, whether you live near a treatment center, family life, all of those things are impacted in every decision that you make every day. Am I going to go to the gym? When's the last time that I did my infusion? Can I play sports or participate? So those are the kinds of things that were talked about. Number one on the list was pain. 2/3 of the individuals live with chronic pain or under pain management. And the second most important one on that list was anxiety. And I think we all know about the challenges with the opioid use in the country and the mental health challenges that are going on. I think we just saw in the paper last week that the U.S. population is one of the most stressed in the world. And so manage the impact of living with hemophilia on top of that. So can we find ways to actually measure those and have them included in the value proposition? And could gene therapy address aspects of our lives that standard of care is not? It's something novel, it's something perhaps different than the way, and this is not typically modeled in the kind of quality analysis that we talk about. So ICER actually just reviewed a hemophilia drug. So they reviewed another drug, a novel mimetic, that was originally brought to market to treat those that have inhibitory antibodies to the standard of care. The cost can run in the millions for these patients, and they're in the hospital 30 plus times a year, bleeding at least once a week. But nevertheless, this drug has actually gone on to have an expanded indication for the general patient population. It's financially toxic. The drug bills, I think as you've already heard, are $500,000 up for somebody with severe hemophilia, sort of an average adult male weight. And plus all of the other complications, and knowing that year in and year out I have to come up with a $12,000 copay in January to be able to access my drugs. So changing that paradigm would certainly be important, and the pricing does become important, but ICER too, like the FDA, has acknowledged that there are other contextual factors. If you went and read this report, it would be many of the same things that you actually read on the list. But if you go into the modeling and you go into the quality calculations of what's happening, the kinds of things that I'm talking about in terms of patient impact are typically not included in those. And it's not just because they can't be. Often it's because that data was not collected, it wasn't planned, it wasn't put into the clinical trial development program, it wasn't reported, it's not in the pivotal publications, and therefore at the point that a pricing decision is being made, that a value decision is being made, we don't have the information on the outcomes the most relevant to patients. So through this core heme process, we thought, can we change that paradigm and convince payers that if we can identify that data that includes the typical metrics as well as those that are important to patients, and we get companies, the life sciences companies that are developing those technologies, to include them in their studies, then maybe we'll be better off in the end. And so this whole notion of evidence generation, evidence collection, it clearly has to be robust. But real-world information may well be different than clinical trial information, but we ought to do our best to collect the real-world experience of living with the disease during the clinical trial period. As individuals, and some of you may well live with chronic disease, you spend less than 1% of your time in the clinic or the hospital setting. It's the other 99% of your life that make you who you are, and it's that whole of life experience that we would like to find a way to try to capture. So through our research process, and there's going to be a poster on this tomorrow afternoon, I'll be there if you want to learn sort of the whole process that we went through. We have a couple published articles now. We developed a core set of outcomes, and typically a core set of outcomes is really only 6 to 8 elements. And I sort of break them down in two. So the 2 legacy clinical outcomes that I talked about made this list. Frequency of bleeds and the factor activity level. Although I have a preference for factor activity level, I certainly want to know that it's stopping bleeding, so efficacy and a bleeding metric is important. The 2 patient-centric outcomes, chronic pain and mental health status, that transformative impact of being cured of disease, not having the worry, the fear, the life opportunities that open up, can we measure that? And then two that really, I think, directly relate to payers, the duration of expression that we heard Michael talk about earlier. How long is it going to last? Fortunately, we have some pretty good data, heading out 5 to 10 years. So we think we're going to meet that threshold. And then the utilization of healthcare costs. Again, we have a cost offset, but it may not be sufficient to achieve the advanced standard of care. The other elements, adverse events, I mean, certainly all of those things should be collected as a part of a core event, mortality, and both short and long term. And then there's some other things that didn't quite make our 80% threshold for agreement across all of the stakeholders, but that were recognized important and had over half, and so we encourage those as secondary endpoints. So I guess I'll close sort of with my key takeaways, that I do think that as you're thinking about defining the value proposition, early and active engagement of patients, very much in that translational phase, even as you're thinking about coming to clinic the first time, understanding what are the outcomes that matter to patients, how is it a patient would define success, and developing your clinical programs to incorporate those. If you have active and rigorous engagement, then I think it will serve us all well, not only at the point that you're getting your ticket from the FDA or the EMA or a regulatory body, or you're getting somebody to pay for it in the insurer world, but also patients will be a lot happier, a lot more confident in making the decisions to take what are still novel and potentially high-risk therapies. So think about patients not just as subjects of research studies, but think about patients as active partners in the process. Thank you.
Great. A big thank you to all of the panelists for their presentations. We do have about 30 minutes left, and we'll open it up to questions from the audience. To get it started, I'll throw one out, keeping with the theme of the patient. Mark, you talked about some of the key areas of most important to hemophilia patients, which you've included into your core heme framework. Do you and the other panelists see a value in the collection of quality of life, burden of illness, work productivity, other factors like school, educational attainment, to really fill out the value proposition for gene and cell therapies?
And I think that is the I think that's the core of what I'm talking about. And one of the challenges that we faced is existing PRO, patient-reported outcome instruments, may well not be fit for purpose. The ones that we have historically used in the hemophilia space were developed and validated 20 years ago, when what therapy could achieve is far short of what we expect with gene therapy. Therefore, they have ceiling effects, and they may well not capture. So what we've realized is that in parallel to this kind of work, we may well need to be developing new patient outcome tools that actually could capture that. And the transformational one, I think, really is the most unknown and difficult. We have examples from cancer, from oncology, but that's not a chronic disease. It's something that you acquire, it's episodic, and then you're cured. We have it from liver transplantation, which is actually curative of hemophilia. Certainly a hard way to be cured, but typically in the presence of acute liver disease from the history of Hep C that's dominant in the community. And so we've learned a few lessons, but I think we're still sort of tinkering with the notion of how we can measure that. But that's exactly the core of what we hope can be added and quantified and then built into the value calculations.
Yeah, I would echo that, because I think, as you know, with our LuxAeterna experience, again, no existing real cost offsets, no other therapies specifically directed to inherited retinal diseases. A lot of the challenges that I think that we faced were, how do you capture the value of giving somebody their sight back or restoring their vision? As Steve indicated, we have reports that people are able to get a driver's license, right? How do you value that? And I think a lot of these quality of life assessments, they're challenging in the clinical context, just because they're not well validated, and they don't resonate with the FDA. They want measurable outcomes, and so I think working those into your clinical development plan, working hard to come up with validated measurements, and making sure that we factor those into the value of the therapy is going to be critically important.
Right, and just a quick follow-up, I'll ask Steve to my right, that payers traditionally haven't taken all of those sort of patient considerations into their evaluations, and so Given that you're close to sort of the payer perspective, can you comment on that?
So, historically, most people think of payers as really being just financially driven. And so, but I will tell you that, we look at this as these are our family members, these are our friends, these are who we want to treat. And so the reality is that coming to us, obviously there has to be a financial value that you want to bring forward. But like Sparks, we had no trouble covering Sparks, and it's $425,000 an eye because it's the right thing to do. And in many of your products, it's going to be the right thing to do. These are major advances, and so, as you heard me say, we have got to work together to figure out how to justify this for the payer community. I will tell you as a note of caution, there are self-funded plans that are starting to write in their language that they don't want to cover gene therapy. They need to make a bright line, and so we as a community are really going to have to be able to demonstrate how this is truly changing patients' lives, and not just in soft metrics, but we're going to need some hard metrics of presenteeism, productivity in the workplace, other things, because we do not want this to be cut off prematurely, which is what we saw in Europe in many cases. And so we're going to have to work together. Which gives me the final point, and that is, come see us early. We are more than willing to sit down and talk with you. What the FDA requires for you to get a drug approved and what I'm going to require for you to get a drug paid for are often two different things. And so our doors are open. We want to talk to you early.
Question?
I can go. If people do have questions, we've got a microphone in the middle, so please feel free to go ahead and queue up. Just building on some of the value discussions, similar to what I asked Michael Sherman. So how should biotechnology companies, patients, academics working in the field view groups like ICER, view the quality adjusted life years model, which for many of us is relatively new on the scene in the United States. We're maybe more familiar with it in other places like the UK. How do you think about that? And then I'll ask everybody to just opine on that. And then Steve, you teased out a little bit of, hey, look, another, kind of an alternative. Maybe there's another way to think about it, and maybe some of the people in the community, the biotech companies and others, should be thinking about alternative ways to put frameworks there so we can all think about assessments the same way as opposed to a hodgepodge approach. So if you have other thoughts on that you want to unpack for us, that would be helpful too. So maybe you could start.
Yeah, I'll start. I think the market perceives, and sometimes correctly, that pharma and bio price their drug at whatever the market will bear. You may not agree with that, but I will tell you that that's just the perception payers have, is it's whatever the market will bear. And I don't believe that's going to be sustainable. And you have a choice. You can either figure out how to regulate yourself, or you can eventually let the government regulate you. As you know, there's a proposal right now in front of CMS about international price comparisons. And so if that moves forward, that's essentially the cheap way for America to import price controls from other countries. And why is that? It's because we have a community that's talking about doing a lot more radical things in healthcare expenses than just that, right? So we have a lot of people talking about Medicare for all and other proposals where essentially the patients out there are saying and the payers out there are saying, you know what, the current system isn't working for us. I don't care. I'm willing to try even government-regulated health care. I really fear that for the following reason. I believe that we have the most innovative healthcare environment in the world here in the United States, but it is a really fragile thing. And unless we work together and unless we actually put other proposals out there, in the absence of other proposals, someone's going to move forward with a government-regulated proposal. And so I believe the marketplace can work, but we're going to have to compromise between the payers and the patients, the providers. All of us are going to have to come together and figure out, what does value mean? ICER is a good attempt. It's a base to start from. NICE is another attempt. You may not like that one because that's they often say no, but we are going to have to do something. And unless you all organize in some way to come up with a better proposal, I have payers, employers right now asking me to create an ICER-only formulary. If you don't make the ICER price, you don't make the formulary. And so the demand is there, and I'm not, and so that's the direction that this is going. And so I think that we need to derail those conversations by coming up with some logical way by which we can look at drug pricing and value. Other countries have done it. We can't claim that it can't be done just because it's hard.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, obviously, we went through an ICER review with LuxAeterna. I think we were the first company to go through their gene therapy model. I think we came through that pretty well. It certainly has challenges. I think our biggest concern was kind of a lack of transparency around what's in that model, and I think in many respects the model was still being built as we were working our way through it. And so, to me, groups like ICER and others can play an important role, but I don't think it's going to be the silver bullet that solves all of the problems. But I think we also need to think, Steve indicated, much more broadly about what does value mean for a specific therapeutic, and again, I think part of the solution has to be tying the price to that value. So if it doesn't work, we shouldn't get paid. And I think that can go a long way at easing some of the concerns of high cost therapies that just may go on in perpetuity. I mean, if you look at a lot of the high cost therapies that are chronic therapies now, they have high price tags, but people forget that that's an annual payment or that's a monthly payment. If you look at the lifetime cost of some of these therapies, they far exceed what a one-time therapy cost of a gene therapy is going to be, and especially if you can tie that back to actually stopping payment if it's no longer working. I think there's a lot of savings in the health system to be had.
I think we have a couple of...
Sorry, Mark.
Yeah. So I don't speak for ICER. I just happen to be on the board. And one of my interests in joining the board was because it is the world in which we live. Most of the rest of the world has a value calculation in terms of what it does, and I think we're sort of silly to think that the U.S. is not going to move in that direction ultimately. And so it was important to me that we try to shape that calculation. I have been open that I'm not an enormous fan of QALYs, but it is a framework. And so the question to me is, how is the QALY calculated and what are the inputs? NICE in the UK uses something called a discount rate that actually allows for greater value of longer-term benefits. So someone who's born with a hereditary disease and might now live 70 years, those extra sort of 30 or 40 years of good living may not get calculated and get full value in a calculation. So there's things that we can do in terms of the modeling that will make it work for the patients. The Swedish HTA agency, they include concepts of societal willingness to pay. Now, maybe we're not going to do that in the U.S., but there are ways to, if you understand the model, to allow them to be reflective of what is important to society. And so my theory was sort of to be involved in the process and try to help influence and shape that. But I don't see ICER as a villain. I see it as a reality that is important for us, and that if we really work together on the creative solutions, I think just like we're seeing with ICER looking at sort of the life years gained approach, we may have the opportunity. They do have an ultra-rare formula, which LuxAeterna would have gone through, which Hemlibra, the hemophilia drug that I was talking about, went through, and it does allow for broader contextual considerations to be actually in the formula than some of their other, so they are making progress to say that we do need to modify and think about some of these life-changing therapies a little bit differently, but it's very much a work in progress.
Hi. I'm wondering how you think about the idea of having centers of excellence and kind of flipping the model to bring patients to drug instead of the other way around, and how important was that for bringing drugs to the market, and how is that going to affect the patients in that post-commercialization world?
Maybe I'll just start. I think it certainly depends on the specific therapy. I mean, for LuxAeterna, we're talking about an extremely ultra-rare condition where, we think there are, max 2,000 patients in the United States, not all of which will necessarily be eligible. It lended itself to a model of having a limited number of centers of excellence. I think what was also critical there is this is just not an IV administration. This is a subretinal procedure, and while it's not the most complex surgical procedure in the world, you want to make sure you get it right, and you want to make sure that the physician that you're having administered has been properly trained. So I think we work very closely with the patients that we are treating. We work to ensure that there's very little interruption to their lives as possible. And again, in the circumstance of LuxAeterna, you're dealing with patients who are compromised visually. So it's not only maybe bringing them to that treatment center, but it may be a companion or a family member or somebody else. And given some of the logistical challenges around it, they're also there for potentially a week or two between the first eye being treated and the second eye treated. So we work very carefully to ensure that their needs are taken care of, that we make sure that we can get them from point A to point B and back. So far that model has worked well for LuxAeterna.
I was going to say, in the hemophilia space, we have 140 federally funded treatment centers around the country, and I have some concerns. I mean, we don't know how gene therapy is going to roll out. Right now, a candidate that's in the gene therapy trial has weekly lab draws for the first sort of 15 to 30 weeks, and it requires sort of specialized real-time analysis to know when to intervene with corticosteroids or something if you have your transaminase levels go up. That would be very difficult to maybe get properly interpreted if it was very diffuse, but also very inconvenient for a patient. So what we really need is probably a hybrid approach where the actual injection, which for us is just sort of a shot and you're in and out of the hospital in a couple hours, versus a surgical procedure, but then allow a system where you can have the remote real-time monitoring with the skills. So I expect that it will be a blend, whatever the disease is and how the vector is administered.
So we've already built a service that's fit for purpose. So we actually, for diseases like CAR T therapies, like LuxAeterna, where centers of excellence make sense, we support those centers of excellence. In the broader distributed model, so if you have a common disease where people either have to have the service come to them, we actually have a nurse already within 90 minutes of almost everyone in the United States. So we can do monitoring in the home, and so we believe that it has to be fit for purpose for the type of product and service you're trying to put into the marketplace. And so having those support services, having them at scale so we're not adding to the cost, but actually giving patients and making it a patient-centric experience, where we're building this around the patients but having uniformity of data collection, because one of the really important things that you need someone who's going to actually collect the data in the way you're going to want the data collected, in which the FDA is going to want the data collected. And so limiting that to a couple providers who can actually do a high-quality job, regardless of the distribution model, is going to be important.
Hi, my name is Ora McKinsey. I'm with Bluebird. And Steve, I think this question is primarily for you. You mentioned 5-10 minutes ago that there's some examples of maybe employer plans who are specifically saying no coverage for gene therapies. Now, I recognize that there's an issue with specialty and things like that, but do you think it's correct that gene therapies should end up in a bucket by themselves rather than the greater context of orphans or what have you?
Yeah, so the issue of employers, this is just representative of the stress the employers are under. And there are employers who truly are looking at potentially going out of business because of one or two claimants in their small employee base. And so we definitely don't support it. We obviously are big advocates. We believe that we have to be as innovative on the payment side, and so we got to figure out how to provide them financial protection. And so we're looking at, I already told you we touch 160 million lives. We're trying to look at, can we create risk pools that are even larger than that? Can we even create risk pools that are international? Cigna is the largest provider of expat healthcare around the world. Can we look at even bringing in other countries for this? So we have got to figure out how to actually, insurance is supposed to spread the risk. It's why it was created. And so we have got to figure out how to be creative, how to spread the risk, because I believe the amount of money is there. It's just the distribution of it. So I got to cut off, and I have a real urgency for this because I want to do it before the market starts fragmenting. Because if it starts fragmenting, you're not going to be able to create the risk pools that are going to be large enough to cover this. And I will tell you that many of you are thinking reinsurance is going to be the backstop for this. The reinsurers are going to get out of this business relatively quickly when they start seeing it, because the trouble is there are certain populations like hemophilia that are known well in advance. There's other populations like SMA where it isn't known in advance. SMA is more conducive to the traditional insurance product. Hemophilia is not, because how do I avoid adverse risk selection? If I'm the only one that's going to cover gene therapy, I'm going to have every single hemophiliac signed up for my policy. And so those are some of the considerations we have to take into place, but we got to stop this before it becomes a common practice amongst employers.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Bigler with Therapeutic Genetics Consulting Associates. So my question is about the value-based contracting. Since there's multiple manufacturers, multiple payers, multiple Medicaid, how much parity can there be, between the outcome measures that are specifically selected by different payers in these agreements, and also maybe the different timelines, the different payment structures? I could imagine that in some situations one company gets a really great deal and another payer gets a not so great deal. So how can this be like a level playing ground for everyone?
Yeah, so again, we're trying to create this where it can be purchased well beyond our walls. So I'll give you a couple examples. We have, for 25 million Americans, we have created something called inflammatory care value. All the companies have agreed to give us money if a patient is on an anti-inflammatory, Enbrel, Humira, Cimzia, those type of drugs. If the patient changes in the first 90 days for whatever reason, lack of clinical efficacy, side effects, or just plain non-adherence, the manufacturers are refunding 2/3 of the money back. And 25% of patients do change in the first 90 days. And so we make this available broadly. And so not only are we able to get you the best price, we're able to have the broadest formulary. The doctors love it because they can choose any product they want, because they're also often doing this through trial and error. The patients like it because they're not getting stopped at the pharmacy counter saying you need a prior authorization. And the manufacturers like it because we're driving better adherence, and so they're getting more fills when a patient is on their products. We can create these wins across the marketplace, but as you can see, this is pretty innovative. And so we're going to have to break a sweat, figure out how we do this with gene therapies. Let's be very frank. In hemophilia, for instance, there's so many companies vying for this. You may even be pitting these companies against each other at some point in time. My friends here don't like to hear that, but that's the reality.
We're expecting.
There's a lot of other diseases where there's only going to be one, and we're going to be a price acceptor. And so then the question is, how do we work with you all to backstop that, to say, society wants value. What are you willing to guarantee if it quits working over time? But we're going to have to continue to innovate, and this is why we want you to come in early. We want to talk about this. We need your best thinking. We don't have all the good ideas, and so we're very open to learning from others.
Maybe I'll just add a couple quick points. One, from the LuxAeterna experience, it was an extremely heavy lift, right, in terms of all the contracting, reaching each of those payers. I think we were very pleased with the amount of commercial lives coverage, with almost 85% of commercial lives having a good medical policy within the first 9 months of launch, which we thought was terrific. But it wasn't without a significant amount of effort. It is obviously a sample set of one, and it was a small patient population. So in many respects, it was a really it was a unique test case, right? If we had started with a much larger patient population, like hemophilia, it would have been a much greater challenge. But I think it is. There are a lot of lessons to be learned, but there's a lot of I think potential to see a a business model that can be flexed into larger populations.
There's one other aspect which I think also bodes for early patient engagement with payers is when you're thinking about the indicated patient population. So most of the gene therapy trials are for the severe patients, those like myself that have less than 1% factor. But if I would benefit from having 15% or 40% level of circulating factor, and the trials are for those less than 1, what about those that are in the low moderate range that are in 2, 3, 4, and 5? And we really need to begin to think about sort of expanded coverage with evidence development or other kinds of avenues, partnering with patient organizations early to help them understand what those expanded concentric circles could be. Is it the hepatitis model where we worked through sort of the different grades of liver disease, eventually to everyone, and what would be required, because patient organizations are either going to be beating on the door saying, we all want it, or they're going to say, there is a plan and we hope to have it for everyone, but this is the process we have to go through and the evidence we have to generate. And if the patient organizations and the other partners are not brought along, then it probably is going to be a fury in sort of the media and before Congress and everywhere else at that point. So that early partnership to understand the evolution of the indicated patient, I think is going to be really critical for particularly diseases like hemophilia. May be different than when we're talking about the blindness, where it's a much narrower differentiation.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question.
Okay, this is Dave Siegel from UC Davis. Is there anything to be learned here from vaccines? Because vaccines, like a gene therapy, it's a virus. Vaccine is a virus. For me, as the recipient, vaccine's very cheap, has a long-lasting effect, and there's no discussion about pricing these vaccines based on a formula for years of life, preserved from that. Can gene therapy get to a stage like vaccines?
I'll just, so Jonas Salks actually gave away the patent, as you know. So vaccines are very cheap. Vaccines are also used on enormous populations, and so it's a different type of model. So there are some things that you point out scientifically that are very similar. There's other things that are very distinct. The trouble is we have never actually priced drugs based on value. Otherwise, antibiotics and vaccines would be wildly expensive because they really cure people and they preserve life and prolong life. And things like cancer therapies that are given at the very end stage of life that only prolong your life by 5 or 6 months would be very inexpensive. That's not how we price in the U.S. marketplace or even in the world marketplace. And so your point is well taken. That is, we have a system that has never priced for value, and that's part of why everyone's struggling with this. Is for the first time you hear everyone saying, well, you got to price it for value, and we have no system that actually has been set up for that. And so it's a new day, a new paradigm, but we're going to have to figure out some way to fit these in. Like I said, we spend a lot of money in healthcare. There's room in the budget for it. We're just going to have to work together to figure out how to make that work.
Well, just to build on that, one other point. I spent a few years in the antibiotics market for antibiotics to combat superbugs. And if you want Exhibit A on what happens when you get rock bottom drug pricing, I can introduce you to the superbugs crisis, because all rational actors in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry fled the market over the last 30 years because all the money was wrung out of the system. So it's a little bit akin to what Steve was talking earlier about. You want to see failures, look at Europe with gene therapy. You want to see failures in the U.S. I would argue antibiotics is a good example. So, okay, I think with that we're done. I want to thank my colleague Francesca for doing a great job co-moderating this panel, and for our outstanding panelists, please join me in giving them a big round of applause.
Okay. Yeah, she texted
Thanks.